She noticed him immediately, not because of the watch that probably cost more than her annual salary, or the way the maitre d' practically sprinted across the marble floor to greet him, but because of his eyes. They were tired in a way that money couldn't fix. She recognized that kind of tired. She'd seen it in her own mirror. Every morning since her mother's hospital bills started arriving. The restaurant was one of those places in downtown Chicago where a single appetizer cost what Elena made in a full shift. She worked here 5 nights a week, took a second job cleaning offices on weekends, and sent whatever was left to her mother in San Antonio. She was 26 years old and hadn't slept more than 5 hours in a single night for the past 8 months. But she showed up, smiled, and made sure every table felt like the most important table in the room. The man's name was Richard Calloway. She overheard it when the maitre d' whispered it to the floor manager with visible reverence. Richard Calloway, the CEO of Calloway Innovations, a tech firm reportedly on the verge of a $200 million partnership with a German manufacturing company. The deal, if it closed, would create thousands of jobs across the American Midwest. It was the kind of story that had been circling the business pages for weeks. He was seated at table 7, along with 3 other men in equally expensive suits. One of them, a tall man with silver-rimmed glasses and a polished, practiced smile, was introduced as Hans Brenner, the lead German representative. The 4th man, younger with restless eyes and quick hands, was introduced as Marcus Webb, Calloway's personal interpreter for the evening. Elena was assigned to their table. She brought water, took their drink orders, and moved with practiced efficiency around the edges of their conversation. She wasn't eavesdropping, not exactly, but the table was small. The restaurant was intimate, and 11 years of working in service had trained her ears without her permission. You heard things. You always heard things. What caught her attention first was small. A hesitation, a flicker across Hans Brenner's face when Marcus translated something Calloway had said about the proposed timeline. It wasn't offense, exactly. It was confusion followed by something harder, a quiet, professional withdrawal, the kind of expression a person makes when they suspect they're being handled rather than respected. Elena set down the bread basket and moved away, but something pulled at her like a thread caught on a nail. She'd grown up in a military family that moved constantly. By the time she was 18, she'd lived in 4 countries, including 2 years in Frankfurt when her father was stationed there. She'd gone to a local school, made friends, learned to argue and laugh and apologize in German. She wasn't fluent anymore. Years had softened the edges, but she understood enough. More than enough. And what she was hearing from Marcus Webb was not what Hans Brenner was saying. It started clearly enough. Brenner made a comment about the proposed equity structure, a genuine concern, phrased carefully, diplomatically, as an opening for negotiation. Marcus translated it as a compliment on the deal's structure. A minor curiosity about timeline. Elena stood at the service station pretending to organize silverware, her pulse quickening. Maybe she'd misheard. Her German was rusty. She waited. Then Brenner spoke again, more directly this time. He said, and Elena was certain of this, that his board had specific concerns about intellectual property, protections, and that they needed explicit contractual language before moving forward. It was a reasonable professional request, non-negotiable language, he'd emphasized. The German word landed clearly. Marcus told Calloway that Brenner was enthusiastic and was looking forward to moving to the next phase. Elena felt the bread basket nearly slip from her hands. She stood very still for a moment, running through everything she knew about this situation. This wasn't her business. This was a $200 million negotiation between powerful people in expensive suits. She was a waitress working a Thursday night shift. She needed this job. The floor manager had told staff explicitly that they were not to engage the Calloway table beyond their service duties. The firm had made a specific request for privacy. She thought about her mother. She thought about the 3 shifts she still needed this week to cover the copay that had arrived yesterday in a plain white envelope. Then she watched Richard Calloway nod with confident satisfaction at something that Hans Brenner had never said, and she made a decision. She waited until the table paused its conversation for a natural break, when Calloway leaned back to glance at the menu again. Then Elena approached quietly, leaned slightly toward him, and in a voice barely above a breath said, "Excuse me, Mr. Calloway, I'm so sorry to interrupt. I just need a moment of your time privately before I take your entree order. Please." The table went still. Marcus Webb's eyes snapped to her like a searchlight. Calloway looked at her, really looked at her, with the measured assessment of a man who had learned to read rooms for a living. Something in her expression must have communicated the seriousness, because he excused himself from the table without a word and followed her to a quiet alcove near the kitchen corridor. "I need you to understand I could lose my job for this," she said, her voice steady despite her heart throwing itself against her ribs. "But your translator is lying to you." "Not mistranslating. Lying. Mr. Brenner just told you his board has non-negotiable concerns about IP protections and that they need explicit contractual language before they'll proceed. Your interpreter told you he was enthusiastic and ready to move forward." Calloway stared at her. "You speak German." "Enough. I grew up partly in Frankfurt." She looked him directly in the eye. "I don't know why your translator is doing this. Maybe he has his own interests in this deal falling apart. Maybe there's something I'm not seeing. But you deserve to know what was actually being said." For a long moment, Richard Calloway said nothing. He was looking at her the way people look at something that has disrupted a pattern. They trusted, with a mix of disorientation and dawning recalibration. Then he nodded once. "Thank you," he said quietly. "Please bring out the appetizers." "Take your time." She returned to her station, her hands trembling slightly, and waited for the consequences to arrive. What happened next she only partly witnessed. Calloway returned to the table, and within minutes, the temperature of the conversation shifted. His tone changed, became more careful, more probing, more honest. Marcus Webb grew visibly rigid. At some point, Calloway said something quietly to one of his associates, who stepped away from the table and made a phone call. By the time Elena brought the entrees, Marcus Webb was no longer seated with the group. Hans Brenner, she noticed, seemed to relax for the first time all evening. The deal didn't close that night, but it didn't collapse either. When the table finally finished and the men stood to leave, Hans Brenner paused near the service station and said, in careful but earnest English, "The food was excellent. Thank you for the care you showed tonight." He didn't look directly at her when he said it, but she understood. Richard Calloway was the last one out. He stopped at the register, said something to the manager, and then turned to find Elena clearing a nearby table. He handed her a card and a folded bill, and both of which she tried to refuse. "I don't do this lightly," he said simply, "and I don't forget." The bill was enough to cover her mother's copay 3 times over. The card had a number handwritten on the back and 2 words underneath his name. "Call Monday," she called. The rest of the story isn't about money, though there was some. It's about the fact that the Calloway-Brenner deal renegotiated over the following weeks with a certified independent interpreter and full IP protections. Written into the contract, created over 4,000 manufacturing jobs in Ohio and Michigan over the next 2 years. It's about Hans Brenner, who later said in an interview that an act of unexpected honesty from a stranger in Chicago had restored his confidence in the partnership entirely. And it's about Elena Vasquez, who learned that doing the right thing in a terrifying moment doesn't always cost you everything. Sometimes quietly and without fanfare. It opens a door you never knew you were standing in front of. She still tips well. She always will.